The White Feather. The morning mist clung to the Vietnamese highland village like a shroud when Marine sniper Carlos Hathcock, known by his call sign White Feather for the lucky charm he wore in his boonie hat, found himself facing the most unconventional mission of his tour. Intelligence had reported that a Viet Cong patrol was moving through the area, but when Hathcock and his spotter reached the remote hamlet of Ban Mi Thuot, they discovered something far more complex than a simple elimination target. Through his scope, Hathcock studied the settlement below. 22 villagers, elderly farmers, mothers with infants, children no older than 10, moved with the careful deliberation of people walking on broken glass. The local commander had issued clear orders: neutralize any confirmed enemy combatants and extract intelligence about VC movements. What he hadn't anticipated was finding a community paralyzed by terror, where a single wrong move could trigger a massacre. Hathcock's reputation preceded him. In a war where body counts dominated headlines, he had earned legendary status for his precision and lethality. Fellow Marines spoke in hushed tones about impossible shots made at distances that defied belief. The white feather tucked into his boonie hat had become a symbol whispered about in both American firebases and enemy camps across the Vietnamese highlands. But as he observed the village through his scope that first dawn, something unexpected happened. Instead of calculating wind drift and target acquisition, he found himself studying the subtle dynamics of a community in crisis. An elderly village chief named Nguyen sat motionless outside his hut, his weathered hands trembling not from age, but from the impossible position he faced. 3 days earlier, VC fighters had demanded food and shelter. 2 days earlier, an American patrol had arrived asking about enemy movements. The chief knew that any answer he gave, to either side, could doom his people. Children played quietly in the dirt, their usual laughter muted by an atmosphere thick with unspoken dread. The morning air carried the scent of cooking rice from the village shrine, where offerings suggested the villagers were preparing for death. Corporal Burke, Hathcock's spotter, whispered the tactical assessment. 2 confirmed VC sympathizers. Possible weapons cache in the third hut. Recommend standard search and interrogation protocol. But Hathcock noticed something Burke had missed. The way the villagers' eyes tracked not toward hidden weapons or escape routes, but toward that small shrine where offerings of rice and incense burned like quiet prayers. These people weren't hiding an arsenal. They were saying goodbye. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. What happens when a soldier trained to see only targets suddenly recognizes human faces? Instead of moving in with overwhelming force, Hathcock made a decision that would have baffled his superiors. He instructed Burke to remain in overwatch position while he approached the village alone, his rifle slung and his hands visible. The villagers froze as the legendary American sniper walked into their midst, but instead of barking orders or demanding answers, he sat down beside the village chief and began to speak in his limited Vietnamese. "Chung toi kong muon lam ton thuong ai," Hathcock said slowly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "We don't want to hurt anyone." Chief Nguyen's eyes widened slightly. In the Arkansas woods, where Hathcock had grown up, patience was survival and understanding. Your environment meant the difference between success and failure. He applied that same methodical observation to human terrain now, watching how information flowed through the village, identifying who held real influence versus who merely appeared to be in charge. A young mother emerged from the third hut, the one Burke had identified as a potential weapons cache. She cradled a feverish infant, her movements growing increasingly desperate as the child's cries weakened. In that moment, Hathcock saw not a potential security risk, but a medical crisis that transcended politics. From his field medical kit, He produced antibiotics and oral rehydration salts, standard supplies that had saved American lives but were precious beyond measure in this remote village. The mother's hands shook as she accepted the medicine, her eyes darting between Hathcock and the village elders. "Come on," she whispered. "Thank you." Word spread quickly through the 22 villagers that the feared American sniper was treating sick children rather than taking prisoners. Something remarkable occurred. Village elders began to speak more openly, not about military intelligence, but about the impossible choices they faced daily. A teenage boy stepped forward, his voice barely audible. "I carry messages for the VC, not because I believe, but because they said they would kill my family if I refused." An older farmer nodded grimly. "I hid rice from your patrols last month, not to aid the enemy, but because the soldiers before you took everything. My children were starving." As the morning progressed, Hathcock realized he was witnessing something his training hadn't prepared him for. A community where survival required constant betrayal of someone, where loyalty itself had become a luxury no one could afford. Traditional military doctrine demanded clear categories: friendly, hostile, or neutral. But these villagers existed in the spaces between such certainties, their lives governed by calculations too complex for standard operating procedures. In the distance, Burke's radio crackled with status requests from command. Hathcock ignored them, focusing instead on the rice being shared at the shrine, the same rice that had been offered to departed ancestors, now being distributed to hungry children. How long can a man carry two conflicting truths without something breaking inside? What emerged over the next 6 hours was not an interrogation, but something resembling a negotiation between worldviews. Hathcock found himself caught between the mission parameters drummed into him at Camp Pendleton and the complex reality unfolding before his eyes. The white feather in his hat, once a symbol of deadly precision, now seemed to catch every breath of wind that carried the villagers' whispered confessions. Chief Nguyen spoke quietly of impossible choices. When the VC come, they demand rice and silence. When Americans come, they demand information and cooperation. There is no path that doesn't lead to someone's death. Rather than forcing the village into false compliance through intimidation, Hathcock spent the afternoon creating what he privately called breathing room. He established communication protocols that would allow villagers to warn him of genuine VC military activity without appearing to collaborate with Americans. He arranged for medical supplies to be delivered through channels that couldn't be traced to American cooperation. Most importantly, he helped village leaders craft responses to future demands from both sides, answers that were technically truthful but strategically neutral. "You can say you saw no weapons because you didn't," Hathcock explained to the chief. "You can say you spoke to an American because you did, but you don't have to say what we spoke about." Burke's voice crackled over the radio. "White Feather, Command wants a status update. What's your situation?" Hathcock looked around the village. Children were playing more freely now, their voices carrying the tentative sound of normalcy returning. Adults spoke in voices no longer muffled by terror. The paralyzing tension that had gripped the community for weeks was dissipating like the morning mist. "Situation secure," Burke relayed back. "Population stabilized. No hostile contact." What Hathcock didn't report was how the experience was changing his understanding of what victory meant in a war where the lines between combatant and civilian had blurred beyond recognition. The rice offerings at the shrine had been replenished, not for the dead this time, but in gratitude for the living. An elderly woman approached him as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. In her weathered hands, she held a small bowl of rice. "For your journey," she said in broken English. Hathcock accepted the bowl, knowing that this simple grain represented something far more complex than sustenance. It was the same rice that had been demanded by the VC, hidden from American patrols, offered to ancestors, and now freely given in gratitude. Each grain carried the weight of impossible choices. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What does victory look like when the enemy's children are hungry too? By evening, the village had transformed from a powder keg of conflicting loyalties into something approaching stability. As Hathcock prepared to file his after-action report, he struggled with how to document an operation that defied every tactical manual he'd ever studied. He had achieved something unprecedented, neutralizing a potential enemy stronghold without firing a single shot or taking a single prisoner. Burke descended from his overwatch position, confusion evident in his expression. "Sir, I don't understand what happened here. The intelligence said this was a VC stronghold." "Intelligence was wrong," Hathcock replied, watching the village children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "These aren't enemy combatants. They're people caught in the middle, trying to survive." The radio crackled again with another status request. Hathcock picked up the handset, knowing that what he reported would go into official records, would be read by officers who had never sat beside a Vietnamese farmer, and learned that fear looks the same in any language. "Alpha Base, this is White Feather. Mission completed. Area secured through population engagement and medical intervention. No enemy contact. Recommend continued humanitarian support for local population." What he didn't report was how the white feather in his hat now carried a different weight. It had been given to him by his grandfather, a hunter who had taught him that killing was sometimes necessary, but never something to celebrate. In the Arkansas woods, you took only what you needed and wasted nothing. Here in Ban Me Thuot, he was learning that sometimes the most difficult shot was the one you chose not to take. Chief Nguyen approached as Hathcock shouldered his pack. The old man's hands no longer trembled as he offered a small cloth bundle. "Rice for your journey," he said. "And this." Inside the bundle, nestled among the grains, was a single white feather, not from Hathcock's hat, but from a village chicken. "For remembering," the chief explained. "Sometimes the hunter must also know when to be hunted." The words carried layers of meaning that Hathcock was only beginning to understand. In a war where success was measured in body counts, he had discovered something that couldn't be quantified in after-action reports: the weight of mercy, the complexity of survival, and the dangerous realization that the enemy might not be so different from himself. As they prepared to leave, Hathcock tucked the village feather alongside his own. 2 white feathers now marked his passage through the Vietnamese highlands, one representing the deadly precision he was known for, the other commemorating the day he chose a different kind of victory. Burke noticed the addition to his gear, but said nothing. Some truths were too complex for radio traffic. How do you measure victory when the real battle is against your own assumptions? The secret Hathcock would carry for decades was written in the rice offerings that continued long after he left Ban Me Thuot. What Command never learned, what couldn't be included in any official report, was that his medicine and calm approach had quietly created a template that other units began adopting throughout the Vietnamese highlands. 3 months later, a Navy corpsman named Rodriguez approached Hathcock at Firebase Charlie. "Sir, I heard about what you did in that village near Ban Me Thuot. We've got a situation where your methods might work better than standard protocol." Word had spread through unofficial channels, the kind of communication network that existed parallel to official command structures. Soldiers talked to other soldiers. Medics shared stories during supply runs. The white feather technique, as some began calling it, represented a different way of thinking about population control in a war where traditional tactics often created more enemies than they eliminated. But the real secret was deeper than tactical innovation. In the quiet hours before dawn, Hathcock would finger the 2 white feathers in his hat and remember Chief Nguyen's words about hunters and hunted. He was beginning to understand that in Ban Me Thuot, he hadn't just changed tactics, he had discovered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the nature of warfare itself. The rice from the village, carefully preserved in his pack, had become a kind of communion wafer, a reminder of the moment when ideology met reality and reality won. Each grain represented a choice between the certainty of doctrine and the complexity of human truth. Years later, when military historians would analyze the Vietnam conflict, they would miss this story entirely. The official record showed only that Marine sniper Carlos Hathcock had conducted a successful reconnaissance mission near Ban Me Thuot, securing an area through medical intervention and intelligence gathering. The numbers were clean, the outcome positive, the methods unspecified. What the records couldn't capture was the cost of carrying 2 contradictory truths: that Hathcock was a loyal Marine who followed orders, and that following those orders had shown him the dangerous humanity of the enemy. The white feathers had become symbols of a war within a war, the battle between what soldiers were taught to believe and what their own eyes witnessed in villages like Ban Me Thuot. The real secret wasn't tactical or strategic. It was personal and philosophical. The recognition that mercy might be more difficult than violence, that understanding your enemy might be more dangerous than hating them, and that some victories could only be measured in the survival of 22 people whose names would never appear in any official history. When does tactical success become moral transformation? 27 years after the fall of Saigon, Carlos Hathcock sat in his Arkansas cabin, reading a letter that had somehow found its way to him through channels he couldn't begin to trace. The handwriting was careful, the English uncertain but clear. "Dear Mr. White Feather, this is the boy who was 16 when you came to our village. My daughter is doctor now in America. She works in Children's Hospital in California. I want you to know, all 22 people from Ban Me Thuot village survived the war. We remember the medicine. We remember the rice you accepted from grandmother's hands." The letter was signed simply, Duc Nguyen, son of Chief Nguyen. Hathcock set the letter down and walked to his gun cabinet, where 2 white feathers were mounted in a simple frame, museum pieces now, artifacts of a war that had ended decades ago. The official feather, the one that had earned him his call sign and his reputation, sat beside the village feather, the one that had taught him the difference between killing and victory. What the letter confirmed was something he had always wondered about, but never dared investigate: whether the breathing room he had created in Ban Me Thuot had been enough to see those 22 people through to the war's end. The answer had arrived like an unexpected gift, a validation of choices that had cost him nothing in his military record, but everything in his understanding of what it meant to serve. The medicine and calm approach had indeed become a template, though it was never officially documented or recognized. Units throughout Vietnam had quietly adopted variations of the method, creating pockets of stability that existed in the margins between doctrine and necessity. These small victories rarely made it into official histories, but they had saved lives that could now be counted in children and grandchildren scattered across America and Vietnam. Hathcock fingered the rice that he still carried in a small cloth pouch, grains that had somehow never spoiled, preserved perhaps by the weight of memory rather than any practical conservation method. The taste of that rice, freely given by people who had every reason to see him as an enemy, remained sharper in his memory than any of the more celebrated shots he had taken during his tour. The true measure of his innovation, he now understood, hadn't been the lives he had taken with his rifle, but the lives he had saved by recognizing when not to use it. In a war where success was measured in body counts, the most important numbers were the ones that couldn't be counted. the children who grew up to become doctors, the families that remained whole, the moments when enemies chose to see each other as human. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How long does mercy echo through generations of grateful hearts?